month's Principals Community Specialist webinar. My name's Adam McGarren. I'm the National Manager for the Principals Community team. By way of context, for those of you who haven't joined us today or previously, each month we run a specialist webinar in conjunction with our education partners, which covers a wide range of CPD accredited fields. For this month's webinar, we're very lucky to have John Emerson, Vice Chairman from Capital Group International, as well as our very own Vincent O'Neill, CEO of Stanford Brown, who will be presenting an interactive Q&A webinar on navigating the global geopolitical landscape, insights for the present and future. Just to give you a little bit of background on John Emerson works in global distribution as the Vice Chair of Capital Group International. He has 22 years of industry experience, all with the Capital Group. He served as a United States Ambassador to the Federal Republic of Germany from 2013 to 2017. In 2015, John was awarded the State Department's Susan M. Cobb Award for exemplary diplomatic service, which is given annually to one non-career ambassador. And in 2017, he was awarded the CIA Medal and US Navy's Distinguished Public Service Award. Prior to accepting the ambassadorial posting, John was with the President of Capital Group Private Client Services. And before joining Capital, he was a Deputy Assistant to President Clinton. Our other speaker who's helped facilitating today's session is Vincent O'Neill. Vinny, as I mentioned, is the CEO of Stanford Brown and manages a team of highly qualified professionals with extensive experience in unique areas of ability. Vinny grew up in Northern Ireland and completed his undergraduate studies in commerce and law at the University College Dublin. After moving to Australia, he joined Stanford Brown in 2007. So with all the housekeeping covered, I'll hand over to Vinny.
Thank you very much, Adam, and thank you, John, for your time this afternoon. Welcome. I'd like to start, if we can, naturally enough, with unfolding events in Israel and the Middle East in recent days. But one pointed question in particular: how surprised are you at how much the intelligence services appear to have been caught off guard by this?
Well, first of all, Vinny, thank you very much. And Adam, thank you, and all of you for tuning in during your lunch hour. Really appreciate it. I don't think we can start talking about the situation in Israel without acknowledging how horrible and horrific and tragic these attacks have been. This really is Israel's 9/11, maybe even worse than that. And my guess is that there are a lot of folks on this call who are maybe 1 or 2 degrees of separation away from somebody who's directly impacted or in Israel at this point in time. So I just want to acknowledge that, and that, of course, our hearts go out to them.
A very horrific humanitarian situation.
Yeah, exactly. Now, how surprised was I? Shocked. I mean, the fact is Israel controls the internet in Gaza. You can't make a phone call, text, send an email without the SIGINT, the signal intelligence of Israel's Mossad, picking it up, or at least having an opportunity to review it. Israel is known as one of the fundamental functions of the government and its intelligence services is to prevent or protect against some kind of an attack. And of course, they had the surprise attack 50 years ago, the Yom Kippur War. But this is, I think this is much worse in terms of what happened. It wasn't two big armies that came in. It was, sort of a ragtag group that broke through a wall, and they seemed to do it with fairly easily, in a sense.
Not meet resistance.
Not meet resistance. Well, what happened was Israel had sort of moved to a electronic surveillance approach with a lot of video cameras and cellular communications devices, whatever. It took more boots off the ground in the area around Gaza. And so all the Hamas did was they knocked out the surveillance with drones. So they remotely took care of the remote surveillance. And so Israel didn't have the notification of what was going on. And I think there are this is an issue that is really being put on the back burner. I mean, obviously, Israel's got to deal with the current situation. I know we're going to get to that. But once this is over, I am sure there will be a kind of like our 9/11 commission, serious, in-depth inquiry. And this may end up having real ramifications for the Netanyahu government.
And intelligence services more globally, and the
no question. I'm sure
dependence on electronic.
Yeah, there will definitely be lessons learned from that. And also the question is whether the settlements that were kept going into the West Bank, and then as a consequence of that, there were attacks on those settlements. Did that distract the intelligence services and the IDF as they were trying to protect these settlers? So, so there are a whole lot of questions that are going to have to be answered.
Now, let's turn to the events of recent days, and obviously it's unfolding day by day, but keen to get your take on it, but also particularly, I guess, the risks around escalation from here as well, and the role of international players trying to prevent that occurring.
Well, a couple of things. I mean, one, the most immediate response is going to be a full-scale attack on Hamas in Gaza. Israel has got to degrade and defeat Hamas. They've got to do everything they can to rescue the hostages that have been taken, over 100 hostages, I think 9 or 10 of whom we think are American citizens, and citizens of other countries as well, but mostly Israelis. And this is going to be challenging. It's going to be difficult for a couple of reasons. One, don't forget that about, 10 years ago, the Netanyahu government released over 1,000 prisoners, Palestinian prisoners, to gain the release of a single Israeli soldier who had been captured and held hostage. And he was held hostage for over 3 years. And believe me, they tried everything they could to kind of find and identify and spring that person. They were unable to. I mean, Gaza is densely populated, over 2 million people in this relatively small area. I read that in Gaza City, they're talking about today, as of today, with the attacks that have happened as people are hiding, 500 people per square meter. I mean, that per 100 square meters, per 100 square meters. But that's just an enormous amount of density in terms of the population. And it also means that any effort to go into Gaza, and right now the first step is there's a siege of Gaza. So Israel's cutting off electricity, fuel to Gaza. This means within a matter of days or even hours, Gaza will be a dark community, and it'll have real ramifications on drinking water because they have a desalination plant. That's how they get most of their drinking water. That requires a lot of energy to run. And so you're looking at that.
You're looking at an escalating humanitarian crisis.
An escalating humanitarian crisis. And by the way, one of Hamas's objectives clearly has been to goad Israel with the horrific butchery of what they did, goad Israel into an attack that they then can show lots of pictures of dead children,
the retaliation.
And then begin to create, maybe change the narrative and create sort of, at least across the Arab world, a broader condemnation of Israel. And this is not good.
Yeah, can I pause you there for a second, because that's quite a key point. And in particular, it's probably worth then putting this event in the context of probably the broader political scene in the Middle East in recent months and years, because it had been somewhat benign and it appeared that we were potentially making progress to more accommodation there.
Oh, there's no question.
And is this attack potentially an attempt to prevent?
Well, I'll tell you what, we were on the verge of normalization of relationships between the Saudis and the Israelis. And when you look at the Abraham Accords and you look at that, there are only 3 players in the region who would have been against that: Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran. And so you have to believe that, because an immediate consequence of this is that is now put in deep freeze, because the Saudis would require some sort of accommodation from Israel for the Palestinians. Well, that ain't going to happen under these circumstances. And it also puts pressure on the Saudis to be more condemning of Israel. You notice in their initial response, they didn't condemn the attack. They didn't praise it the way the Iranians did, but they simply said, well, this is what happens when you have oppression of a people, Palestinian people, over the years. So, I mean, they've automatically had to go there. So this idea of, that you have to say, if that was one of Hamas's objectives, and I have to believe it was a component of that, that it's going to be a long time before we can get back to that.
And then I'll take you back to sort of the direction you're on. I guess a couple of questions. Where does Israel go from here? And the fears in the international community, I guess, of the potential for an overreach here and escalation.
I mean, it's very tricky. And what was interesting was President Biden gave an extremely emotional speech a couple of days ago, or it was yesterday. And what was interesting was normally you hear from Western leaders of the president condemnation of an attack and then a warning against an overreaction. And particularly if there might be nuclear weapons involved, which isn't the case here. But Biden's speech was silent on that. He was disgusted. This was an evil attack. The United States is going to give Israel everything it needs to defend itself and to protect itself. And that includes, just as we were engaged in an effort to defeat and degrade ISIS, same approach with regard to Hamas, only I think a little bit more complicated. There is concern, obviously, about this broadening. Particularly, all eyes look to the north with Hezbollah and maybe Syria coming in through Lebanon and through Syria in the Golan Heights or what have you. There have been a few rocket attacks there, but no major attack. And I'll tell you, the reason the U.S. has the USS Gerald R. Ford carrier strike force sitting in the Mediterranean off the coast is not so much because of what's happening in Gaza. It's much more to say to Hezbollah and to Syria and to Iran, for that matter, don't even think about it. The Gerald R. Ford has the capacity to carry 90, F-15s, I guess. Fighter jets. That's a lot of fighter jets.
It's a statement of intent.
Yeah, a real statement of intent. You do this, the U.S. hasn't said we'll get involved, but that threat is certainly there. It's a deterrent effect.
And let's talk about those other players in the region then, because that is a lot of question marks or articles written in recent days on what is the potential role of Iran in this. What is your take on that?
Well, there seems to be differences in intelligence. Now, first of all, let's be honest, Iran clearly armed Hamas. They've trained them. They've supported them, financially and also militarily over the years. The question is, did Iran have a direct role in planning and executing this attack? And the initial reports were that Hamas said, oh, yeah, Iran was involved in this. What was interesting to me was after the initially incendiary statement from the Iranian president, basically praising Hamas for this great victory, the next day the official statements of Iran were, but by the way, we had nothing to do with this. Not sure I believe that or not. But in any event, then the American intelligence is that this was reported this morning, that the Iranian leadership was actually caught by surprise, that they did not have an advance notice. It wasn't something that they greenlit or what have you, but they were caught by surprise. I'm not sure where that comes from, but let's just say it's unclear. And let's just say that if over time, and this would be a tell that people could, look towards, over time, you see increasing leaks of intelligence that suggest a much more direct Iranian involvement in this, there will be consequences to that. It may not be an overt military attack. It may be much more covert. It may be asymmetric.
What are the levers that the U.S. would have left to pull?
Well, U.S., Israel, Israel would be, taking the lead on this undoubtedly. But, cyber attacks, more assassinations of scientists or key figures. The U.S. assassinated Soleimani, but that was with Mossad intelligence. Israel's got pretty good intelligence in Iran. So you could see that, or you could see a direct military attack on key assets of Iran. This is not out of the question.
And
not immediately, by the way. They don't want a 2-front or 3-front war now. But once the Hamas situation is resolved, that is not out of the question.
And where do Hezbollah sit in this?
Oh, same thing. Right now the effort is keep them out, and if they come in,
that's likely, particularly if things escalate in Gaza.
Yeah, so far it's hard to tell. It's they're clearly they're more powerful than Hamas. They're better armed than Hamas, so it's a little bit more dangerous from that standpoint. The idea of a 2-front war, but I think the open question is all of a sudden you get the U.S. in there. that's a very different kind of battle. And we haven't made that commitment yet, but when you got that carrier strike force out there, it's certainly a plausible scenario.
So what do you think are the key things to look out for over the immediate days or weeks ahead in terms?
Well, clearly, how does the situation in Gaza play out? Does Israel have to go in there, the IDF, with a ground operation, which I think would result in a lot of casualties on both sides, Israeli casualties as well. I mean, this sort of, door-to-door, house-to-house urban warfare is tough. So you got that. Second thing to keep an eye on is what happens with these hostages. I mean, Hamas has threatened to start executing them publicly. Do they do that? Do they hold the hostages up and say, okay, we'll release these people if you turn on the electricity? I mean, who knows what happens there? That's something else to keep an eye on. Obviously, as you mentioned, keep an eye on the northern part with Lebanon, with Hezbollah, and all that. And then finally, as we just discussed, keep an eye on what the intelligence is that comes out about Iran and Iran's involvement and how that might ultimately play out.
So can I ask you, just given your extensive international experiences, Adam ran through at the outset of the call, how do you place events of recent days in the context of, let's call it, history over the last 40, 50 years in terms of just how much risk, how escalated is the risk level right now in the context of a longer time frame? I
think right now, and we're sort of seeing this in the market reaction, I think right now the risk level is pretty well contained to Israel and Gaza. I think if that were to change, if all of a sudden you're going to have a broader, war with Iran, that could very well change things. Obviously, have implications for the oil market, et cetera. But I think right now it's fairly well contained.
And
not to say it's good.
But, no, certainly, but it's managing it as best as possible in these circumstances. Obviously, political international diplomacy attention in the last 18 months has been all focused on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Can I ask you are there any direct or indirect knock-on implications for what's happening in the Middle East for Ukraine?
Yeah, it's not good for Ukraine. I mean, first of all, how many times have you seen a news story about what's happening in Ukraine in the last 5 days? None. This has been all consuming and will continue to be for quite some time. So all of a sudden, Ukraine is sort of off the front pages, if you will, not quite as much front of mind, particularly even in countries that have been very supportive of it. So
dare I say that's a good outcome for Russia?
That's a very good outcome for Russia. And Vladimir Putin has to be kind of smiling. I will tell you, Israel can't be happy with Russia. I mean, Putin has failed to condemn Hamas for this. He is, ironically, as these attacks were going on, or a day or two after, he was meeting with the prime minister of Iraq on some energy conference. And then the prime minister said, well, Vladimir Putin ought to be a negotiator to try to reach a settlement, a peace settlement between Hamas and Israel, which is, and Israel's been working hard to try to stay in the middle of the Ukraine situation, not condemning Russia. And I'm sure they're not too happy with the reaction of Putin in that. And Putin also has to recognize this, which is in the United States and in other parts of the world, but particularly in the United States, particularly from the right wing of the sort of MAGA wing of the Republican Party in the House of Representatives, we have seen more and more criticism of and an unwillingness to vote for additional aid to Ukraine, additional weapons to Ukraine, coming from that wing. There is still broad bipartisan support in the U.S.
What's the motivator on that? Because yes, they don't like spending, but typically they're comfortable with spending when it comes to military spending.
Yeah, well, the motivator there is you have their leader, Donald Trump, saying Ukraine is not in the national security interest of the United States. And the whole America First concept is, why should we be spending money and resources in these, military conflicts that don't really involve us, ignoring the fact that they really do involve us, and we should focus on the things we care about. But what's ironic about this is that group is also intensely pro-Israel. And so what you're going to see is competition for resources from the United States, and this may happen in some of the other NATO countries as well, for resources to maybe away from or not going to Ukraine and going from Israel. It'd be easier to get. It'd be very easy to get a lot of aid for Israel right now out of the Congress, including from that group, but not so easy to get aid from Ukraine. And then the argument becomes, well, we're doing all this in Israel, we can't be doing this in Ukraine as well. So it's. I think it's not great for Ukraine in that respect. It's a distraction. It keeps them, kind of off the front pages. And while I'm confident that at least under the Biden administration, the U.S. is going to walk and chew gum at the same time and continue supporting both Ukraine and Israel, it's going to be increasingly complicated vis-a-vis Ukraine.
Yeah, we're going to talk U.S. Upcoming presidential election in a few minutes. But while you're on that topic, how important does NATO remain to the U.S.? Critical.
NATO is, historically, our most important alliance. It's a vast alliance. It's not just a military alliance; it's a political alliance as well. Particularly, there's such a bipartisan tradition of focusing on the reality that one thing the U.S. has that some of our adversaries or competitors don't have is these values-based alliances. And that's what NATO's about. That's what AUKUS is about. That's what they're trying to do with the Quad, as an example, if you're thinking about this region of the world. And so it's hugely of vital importance with a lot of bipartisan support. Except I was at a conference 3 weeks ago in Germany where John Bolton, who is Donald Trump's national security advisor for 2 years, also was. And he said flat out that if Trump had been reelected, he would have tried to pull us out of NATO. So, the America First foreign policy does not put great value on alliances. It's like allies are a pain in the ass. Excuse my French, but allies require us to do things that aren't necessarily always in our interest. And why should we be bothered with that? And move towards more of just a transactional, I'll do something for you if you do something for me kind of relationship. And the concept of a NATO Article 5, an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. The America First theory is, well, no, that's not an attack on me. It's even though we're the only ones, by the way, in the history of NATO who have invoked Article 5, and that was after 9/11. So, but I would say, notwithstanding that, you still have a lot of mainstream Reagan-Bush Republicans who are very, very much supporters of NATO.
So there's enough bipartisan support still there.
There is, but a president,
MAGA wing.
Yeah, 100%. And you got an election and a president, particularly a president unconstrained by having to run for re-election, might do something like that. So it's something to keep in mind.
Now you talk about American alliances in different regions of the world. Let's move a bit closer to this region and the out there risk that remains when China chooses to take some action in terms of Taiwan and trying to bring Taiwan closer back under central control. What's your take on that? And what do you see following what events in Ukraine and flashpoints in the Middle East? How does China sit there and consider what's the likelihood of an action in the short to medium term?
Very small. And the reason I think that is that Xi Jinping has got his hands full with trying to get the Chinese economy back on track. You want to grow the economy. He's got to deal with the aftermath of the shutdown from COVID, got to deal with the real estate bubble that they have, got to deal with the fact that savings rates in China are way up here. People just aren't spending. He's trying to get that economy going again. And the one certainty is if there were to be a military attack on Taiwan, you would undoubtedly see economic pain coming from the West. There would undoubtedly be sanctions from Europe.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, that one, because obviously Russia was a very different prospect, but the sanctions applied there were significant and severe. Does the West have the appetite for something similar?
I think so. It wouldn't be to the extent of Russia, just because you can't isolate. China's too integrated in the global economy. You're not going to be able to ice them like that, but it would entail some economic pain. And it's not the thing that Xi Jinping wants right now. And also, there are knock-on effects from that. And they're an exporting nation, right? They don't need a global recession. They don't need global inflation fueled by higher energy prices and the like. And there's going to be a knock-on effect to a major conflagration in Taiwan. So now, medium and long term, who knows? But the short to medium term, I think it's highly unlikely, given the challenges they have economically. And by the way, the proof point in that is not only have they refrained from getting involved in the Ukraine. Not only have they refrained from using Ukraine as an excuse or an opportunity to move on Taiwan, they've also refrained from getting involved in Ukraine because, they don't want to pay the economic price. They give lots of lip service to Russia, support for Putin. They have their bilats, my best friend, arm around them. They aren't giving them weapons. Mm-hmm. They're not giving them the technology that Russia needs. Russia had to go to www.northkorea.com to get weapons. It's clearly not getting them from China. So the fact that Xi Jinping is being so careful not to kind of go crosswise with the export controls and sanctions that have been imposed on Russia, so that they don't get hit with secondary sanctions, tells me that why would they invade Taiwan at this point in time? Unless the only thing would be a provocation. You got a presidential election in Taiwan next year, and does that turn on an independence movement or something
statement
like that?
Of independence?
Yeah, that could that could be a sufficient provocation. But short of that, I don't see it happening. And the Taiwanese people aren't stupid either. I mean, there are people in Taiwan who's like, they kind of know there's a feel of how far they can push.
And I'll ask you longer term then, and I appreciate this is a bit more of a how long is a piece of string, but I've seen you speak on this topic before and talked about Xi Jinping and his very clear statement of intent regarding Taiwan. What's your take?
Well, I think one thing we've learned from Putin and Ukraine is when an authoritarian leader makes a statement, like in Putin's case, Ukraine isn't a real country. It's always been part of Russia. It should be part of Russia. That, you got to take that seriously. And he clearly, as part of his, Peter the Great complex, wants to restore the greatness of Mother Russia, and that would include kind of retaking Ukraine. You could argue Russia started in Kyiv, So you got Xi Jinping, who has said, as part of his legacy, he absolutely wants to see the reunification of the mainland and Taiwan by force if necessary, he said. So you have to take that seriously. I just don't think they're going to do it now.
If we can, I might step closer home for you, U.S. politics. And let's talk about events in the U.S. House. Kevin McCarthy obviously ousted from his own side. Where does this leave the functionality and the ability for any sort of bipartisanship?
Not in a good place. I mean, in the Senate, you get a lot of bipartisanship. Mm-hmm. In fact, the Senate, on a bipartisan basis, passed a piece of legislation that would keep the government open. It went to the House. It did include aid to Ukraine, which shows you even the difference between the Senate and the House on that. And McCarthy had to jettison the aid to Ukraine, brought that bill on the table or to the floor of the House. And of course, it passed, but it passed with Democratic votes because that core group of Republicans didn't want it because it didn't have the deep cuts that they were hoping for. None of it which had a snowball's hell and chance in hell, of passing, because the Senate wouldn't agree to it and a Democratic president would veto it. So even if the Senate did, so that's he brought that to the floor to keep the government open, and they threw him out because they were so mad about it. And the problem is he only has a 5-seat majority. Mm-hmm. So there were 8 of his own people who voted against him. That was enough to, kick him out with only a 5-seat majority. So now,
so bipartisanship in that regard is just abhorrent to them.
Complete. Well, the Democrats aren't going to pick the Republican speaker. I mean, that's when you are a party in control, it's your job to pick a speaker. And by the way, remember when they picked him, that was a 15-vote process, right? Well. So one of the things they negotiated was the ability to throw him out if they got mad at him. So so he was kind of a dead man walking anyway as speaker. So now just last night, the Republicans had a vote, and there were 2 guys running, Scalise and Jim Jordan, And Jordan is much more of a hardliner. Scalise, I think, would be more of sort of a traditional Republican, although he's very conservative. But Scalise won. So now the question is, well, what'll that group of 5 people do when it comes to the vote on the floor? Will they go ahead and vote for him or not? And what the Republicans are doing this time, which is a little smarter than the way they handled the last one, they're not playing this out in public. They're doing all their votes and their negotiations behind closed doors. So
We're
it
not going
doesn't
to get
look
the same drama. As
yeah.
last time.
Unfortunately, for the press is very upset about that.
Yeah.
And but I think unquestioned those issues don't go away. The desire of that wing to shut down the government if necessary to make their point that doesn't go away. And so Scalise is going to have to deal with it. It's going to be a challenging time. But one thing that you will see, as I mentioned earlier, you will see support of Israel coming out in a bipartisan basis.
We're seeing strong bipartisan support of Israel. What is the bipartisan position, or is there a bipartisan position in terms of China, and how united is the political force there in terms of being tough on China?
Well, the way it's united is it's one of the few areas where you can truly get bipartisan support is being tough on China.
It's good for votes.
Yeah. We're going to be in a House campaign, Senate campaigns, and a presidential campaign where no candidate is going to want to let their opponent appear to be tougher on China than they are. So unfortunately, we're going into a circumstance where, and this may not be reflected in policy ultimately, but the rhetoric is going to get pretty harsh, I think, as we move fully into our campaign year, our general election year regarding China. And this is a little bit counter to the Biden administration's effort to put a floor under the downward spiral that we've seen in terms of the U.S. relationship with China. And they, at this point, we've had the Tony Blinken visit, the Janet Yellen visit, Gina Raimondo, who's the Secretary of Commerce, just got back from there. And over the weekend, there was the announcement that there will be a Xi Jinping, Joe Biden bilat on the margins of the APEC conference in San Francisco in mid-November. So we're talking with them, which I think is positive, but the rhetoric is going to get complicated.
Particularly as you go through a Republican primary process.
Oh yeah.
We'll come to that in a second, but I might like to talk to your own political background, the Democratic Party, and talk to President Biden, and how strong is the support for him still within his own party?
Well, it's an interesting question. How strong is the support? Not that strong right now. How likely is it he'll have a credible opponent? Zero possibility of that. So he's going to get
from his own side.
From his own side, he's going to get the nomination. And you say, well, what's the reason for that? I mean, 70% of Democrats, when polled, say they'd prefer somebody younger than Biden. Then you ask them who, and they don't really have an answer to it. So the reality is Biden had a really good first 2 years of his presidency. I mean, there were a couple of missteps. Obviously, the Afghan pullout was pretty disastrous. But beyond that, the way he pulled everybody together, our allies in terms of support of Ukraine, the success he had on a bipartisan basis on his economic package, his legislative package, the infrastructure bill, the CHIPS Act, the IRA, all those things were even getting some bipartisan gun legislation done, with gun protection legislation, which is unheard of in these days. So he had some successes, and there are two truths about presidential politics when you're talking about an incumbent president. One is incumbent presidents pretty much always are going to get their party's nomination. I mean, it's rare that even you go back in American history, maybe all the way to the founding of our country, maybe twice an incumbent president who's wanted it hasn't gotten the nomination.
What were the circumstances in those?
Well, one of them was, John Adams served one term, right, and Thomas Jefferson came in, and the other was Lyndon Johnson started running in 1968, and because of all the turmoil around the Vietnam War, an anti-Vietnam War candidate, Gene McCarthy, ran against him in New Hampshire, got 30% of the vote, didn't even beat him. Johnson got 70% of the vote, but it was such a shock at that point that an incumbent president would have that kind of challenge that Johnson just decided not to run. And I think he also assessed it would be impossible for him to run with that Vietnam War around his neck. So those were the two instances. But every time since then, incumbent presidents always gotten the nomination, but they haven't won and by the way, before Johnson, it was all the way back to the founding of our country. They always got the nomination. But then you go to what happens to them if they have a serious primary challenge. And at least in recent history, serious primary challenge means the Democratic president gets the nomination but loses. And the two examples of that were when Pat Buchanan from the right challenged the first President Bush in his primary, he lost to Bill Clinton. And then when Ted Kennedy from the left challenged the Democratic president Jimmy Carter, he lost to Ronald Reagan. So the Democrats, knowing that and being completely freaked out about the idea that Donald Trump might return as president, they do not want to weaken Joe Biden.
They don't want to be seen to be the person that we.
And if you're a politician thinking of running, you're saying, okay, I could run against him, I could challenge him, I get a lot of support, but I'm probably not going to win. And then if he loses, I'll be blamed for Donald Trump coming in and my political career is over. So that's why you see people like, Gavin Newsom of California and some of the others go, I am full score, in front of Biden, which does make it easier for Biden to, in effect, begin running a general election campaign now.
And confidence in terms of Biden's, is it given his age, his physical fitness, his mental fitness to continue in the role? Look,
physically, he sometimes, appears to walk like an old man. I mean, let's be honest, 80 is 80 and all. But mentally, everything I've heard, everybody I've talked to says he's absolutely there mentally, no incapacity. The best analogy I heard is, you may have a baseball pitcher who has been throwing, 92, 93 mile an hour fastballs. Now his fastballs, 88, 89 miles an hour, still a major league pitcher. And the one thing I've heard from a couple of my friends who are on his, senior staff in the White House is, this guy still, you brief him, you better know the answer to the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th level question on that particular topic, because he's going to be asking it, and he's going to expect you to know the answer. And his depth of knowledge and experience, I think, is actually, a lot of people see it as invaluable during this period of time. And so I do think that if there were serious mental issues, that his wife Jill would have, reached across the breakfast table and said, Joe, it's time. And she hasn't done it. She's not somebody who insanely wants to be first lady or has her own political ambitions. She's mainly about protecting him, the way Nancy Reagan was mainly about protecting Ronald Reagan. And I think I don't think she would have let him run if she had a concern.
She didn't think he was fit for it. So we see that's the first half of the election lined up. The second half is playing out in front of us. We have the Republican primaries, the debates going on. Obviously, former President Trump, obviously he's on the record, so he doesn't need to partake in those.
Normally you'd think he would to partake in them, but it's he's the winner of all the debates because they're all attacking each other, and he's just standing off to the side. And his poll numbers have gone up as the debates have, and it's sort of a similar dynamic to what happened in 2015. The year before the year he was elected, when he did participate in the debates. And the thesis of the Republicans running against him then, as well as now, is, boy, if I can get this guy one-on-one, I think I can beat him. He's got a rock core group of support, but it's hard for him to get over 50%. I think I could beat him. The problem is they don't want to jeopardize support in the general election from his political base. So they don't really attack him. They end up attacking each other, which diminishes all of them. And so,
so why don't you take us through that Republican primary process?
Sure.
And how it works and why Trump, unfortunately, fortunately for those that support him, has such a strong hand.
Well, so there's, just to do the math and Republican primary, about 40% of the Republican primary voters are absolute hardcore, unequivocal, no matter what happens, Donald Trump voters. He famously said in 2016, I could shoot somebody in the middle of Fifth Avenue and I wouldn't lose a vote. I call these guys the Fifth Avenue crowd. Right. Now you have another 25 to 30% who like Trump. They like his policies. but they're concerned he wouldn't be the strongest candidate. He's got a lot of baggage. There's all that chaos he brings with him, and they'd prefer somebody else. They just haven't figured out who, because none of these opponents have more than, I think DeSantis is the only one that's even scratching a double-digit support. And then you have the balance, another 25 to 30% who are we lost our light here. So
it'll come back
if it's an automatic light. Let's see what happens. But in any event, the balance of them are folks who are sort of the Reagan-Bush Republicans, and they absolutely don't want Trump to be the nominee under any. This would be like Mitt Romney, who's said he will. Romney has said he will encourage his donors to basically
let there be light.
Let there be light. It's wonderful. Encourage his donors to support somebody, to consolidate about one person other than Trump. But here's the truth. The truth is the way Republican primaries take place is the way you get the nomination is you get delegates awarded by the primaries, and then they go to a convention and vote you in. And the way the Democrats award the delegates proportionally. So you get 40% of the vote, you get 40% of the delegates, maybe a little bit more. The Republican Party, it's first across the post, gets all or most of the delegates. So you get 40% of the vote, and the next guy gets 36, you're getting all the delegates. And so it is.
Plus, you then get a momentum factor.
Oh, you absolutely get a momentum factor. And now this momentum could play the other way. If by some miraculous chance somebody ends up beating Trump in Iowa, New Hampshire, or South Carolina, which are the earliest primary states, that would that person would have enormous push and momentum. I just think it's real hard to see how it would be enough to overcome that 40% support that he's going to have. And the reason is this: fully 70% of Republican primary voters believe the election was stolen. 70. Believe it or not, 70, not 17, 70% tell pollsters, yeah, I think the election was stolen. So they don't care about these indictments. They're like, well, Trump was doing the Lord's work here, right? He was trying to right a wrong. And they're, that makes it even harder. And the other thing that makes it harder is at this point, Biden's approval numbers are no higher than Trump's. And so the argument that Trump would be a weak candidate against Biden kind of goes out the window when he's running a dead heat with him in the general election polls. So I mean, that's why I think we're, offering a rematch to the world between Joe Biden and Donald Trump.
And before we go into how that might play out in the U.S. system, what about some of the other players that are sort of emerging, the likes of Cornel West, Bobby Kennedy Jr., No Labels Group? How do they play?
This is really important because Joe Biden beat Trump both in the Electoral College and obviously in the popular vote in 2020 when he had a one-on-one challenge. Hillary Clinton lost because there was also a Green Party candidate, Jill Stein, who got a whole bunch of votes in those three Midwestern states that Democrats usually win that Trump beat Hillary in. And those are Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And Jill Stein's vote total was greater than the margin of victory that Trump had over Hillary in those states. Not that everyone who voted for her would have voted for Hillary, but I guarantee you nobody who voted for the Green Party candidate was about to vote for Donald Trump. So that was something that hurt. And now you have Cornel West, who's talking about running as an independent. He's a very charismatic professor from Harvard who appeals to young people and progressives, and particularly young people in the Black community. And he is going to run as an independent. I got to believe that, again, not everybody who would vote for him would vote for Biden, but nobody who would vote for him would vote for Trump. So on net, that hurts Biden. And then you've got the No Labels, which is talking about a unity ticket to run up the middle, run in the center. That might take some votes from Trump, but it's also going to take votes from Biden, because on a one-on-one, Biden seems to get centrist Republicans in the suburban areas who just can't stomach Donald Trump. Now, if they have another place to go where I don't have to vote for Trump, but I don't have to vote for Biden either, that without No Labels on the ballot, they would tend to vote for they would tend to vote for Biden. So that is a challenge. I think it's less clear that they're going to run a ticket than that Cornel West will run. And then you have Bobby Kennedy Jr., who was running in the Democratic primary, oddly enough, supported financially by a lot of the MAGA wing of the Republican. What do you say? Why is that? Well, because he's a total anti-vaxxer, conspiracy theorist, just this side of QAnon. On everything's a conspiracy out there, and that appeals to a big wave of the Trump supporters. So the irony is he's now talking about running as an independent. The irony is that might actually take votes away from Donald Trump. I think that would be on a net basis. It also would take votes from Biden, because some people who just don't pay that much attention, they go, "Oh, Bobby Kennedy, I really like him."
That's such a powerful name
in
American politics.
For sure.
How synonymous with the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
Could Republicans?
But all you need is well, don't forget, these are new kind of Republicans.
Yeah.
They're not. These are the Donald Trump, MAGA, I hate the establishment, and this guy Kennedy's attacking the establishment just the way my pal Donald Trump attacked the establishment. So you might, and the tell will be this: if you begin to see Donald Trump attacking Bobby Kennedy Jr., and you see all of a sudden he's no longer getting on Fox News and things like that, that'll be a clear indication that Trump's polling is showing that Kennedy could hurt him. So that'll be interesting to watch.
They'll turn him down very quickly.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
So go into the election. Let's talk about the electoral college system and where this will ultimately. What states does this come down to?
Well, if you, as everybody here knows, I think you don't win by the popular vote. You win by getting 270 electoral college votes. If you won by the popular vote, Hillary Clinton would have been president and Al Gore would have been president. And to get the electoral college votes, those votes are apportioned on the basis of the 2 senators and however many members of Congress each state has. And that's the number of electoral votes they have. And it's typically winner take all by state. So if you were to name 44 states, I can tell you right now whether they'll be red or blue. And when I do that, neither the reds or the blues add up to 270 electoral votes. And that leaves 6 states. Those 3 states in the upper Midwest that Hillary lost, that usually Democrats win, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. The 2 states in the Sun Belt that Republicans typically win that Trump lost, Arizona and Georgia. And I think you also got to throw Nevada in there. It's only got 4 electoral votes, but it's, this thing could be super close.
Yeah.
And the key is this: Biden won by 7.5 million votes, popular vote. But if only 45,000 votes had changed, if Trump got 25,000 more in Wisconsin, 10,000 more in Arizona, 10,000 more in Georgia, he would have had 270 electoral votes. He would have won those 3 states. That would have given him exactly 270 electoral votes, and he would have been president. So it just tells you how tight the margin is. 45,000 votes spread up among those 3 states. And you kind of need to win 3. If you win 3 of those swing states, with the exception of if you win the 3 smallest, but if you win one of the ones in the Midwest and 2 of the others, you're going to get to 270 in all likelihood. And so in 2016, if 80,000 votes had changed in those 3 states, I forget which way, but then Hillary would have been president. So the reality is it's going to be fewer than 100,000 people are going to decide this election, spread out in probably 3 different states of those 5 or 6 swing states. And that's a pretty, these are people who typically make up their mind at the last minute. So maybe they aren't going to vote. Maybe they are going to vote. If they are going to vote, who are they going to vote for? They're typically, pollsters call them the double haters because they don't like either candidate. That's why they're waiting so long to make up their mind. And this is an election where I just tell people, ignore the national polls, focus on what's happening in those states, ignore the ups and downs. This guy had a great debate or a bad debate, or Trump got convicted or said something outrageous or whatever. Just ignore all that. It's going to come down to, I believe, a very, very close election in a handful of states with less than 100,000 votes deciding who wins.
And that's where those other parties, West or Kennedy or No Labels, and that's where
you shave. Yeah, you don't need to shave that many votes from Biden's margin to change that 25,000 win or those 10,000 wins in those 3 states.
So watch this space. But
Yeah.
no doubt, some entertaining time ahead in the primary process.
Yeah,
Lots of
I think that's right.
outrageous claims and counterclaims.
Yeah.
It's made for TV. We have got an opportunity to take a few questions, so please do submit those and they'll pass them through to us. I might kick us off with one, take a slight change of gear, just talk more macro. In the post-COVID era, we've seen a trend towards nearshoring in terms of global supply. And I'm keen to get your take what that might mean for different regions, for different economies.
Well, there's two things going on. I mean, one is, particularly if you look at the United States, and I think other countries are thinking about this, there's a desire to bring back manufacturing, to kind of rebuild the manufacturing base in their country. So part of it is that. But fundamentally, I mean, supply chains are driven by companies, right? I don't think there's a multinational company on the planet that isn't seriously thinking about whether they ought to diversify their supply chains or bring them at least closer. And, COVID sort of put a spotlight on the vulnerability of supply chains. So what if there's another pandemic? What if there's a regional conflict, military conflict? What if there is a major weather event? What if there's a disaster in a particular country and they decide, say India or China, which produces a lot of pharmaceuticals, I'm going to keep this stuff for our people. I mean, so I think everybody's taking a serious look at it. There's also a focus on the global South. Nearshoring could be advantageous for the United States and Latin America, for Europe and Africa. So there's some thinking about all of that. But, it's hard to unwind these. And it's you got to get people, not only do you need factories built, you need people trained. But I think there is definitely a trend away from sort of just-in-time manufacturing to just-in-case inventory management. And we're seeing that playing out around the world.
And we've certainly seen that, I guess, on things like medical supplies, huge focus on Taiwan and
semiconductors. 100%.
The most likely potential cause of the next global
war. You got semiconductor fabs that are being manufactured in the United States, in Germany, in India, putting a lot of money into that. In India, just trying to let's spread that around a little bit too. And then another piece of supply chain though that's interesting is raw materials. And China's got a pretty good. I mean, they were smart. They've been acquiring cobalt mines and rare earth mines and all that. Canada's got a bunch of rare earths. China owns the mines, so not all of them, but I mean, a couple of the significant ones. The U.S., idiots that we are, about 15 years ago, sold that giant cobalt mine in the Congo to China. So there, there's, and then somebody at a conference I was at, somebody mentioned that a sophisticated semiconductor chip touches 47 borders before it gets completed when you consider all the raw materials that have to ultimately go into that, which is pretty amazing. Yeah. I mean, how people figured all this out is beyond me. But.
And you mentioned there, you talked about weather events and other things. Can I get your take on where both sides of US politics sit on the climate change and action for climate change?
Completely opposite sides of the fence.
Shock horror.
I mean, it is a motivational issue for the Democratic Party, particularly for young people in America who are increasingly voting Democratic. But yeah, climate it's a huge topic, and it is a poisonous topic on the Republican side.
To be seen to be
you got climate to be seen to be pro climate
action.
Change. Even ESG investing has become. There are some Republican states that their state pension funds have passed. They will They're firing any investment management firms. Not even if they have an ESG mandate, but if the firm itself has ESG funds, they're firing. BlackRock's actually been fired by a couple of firms. I think it's Texas and Louisiana are two that have done that already. And so, the politics of it is insane. And the odd thing is, some of these, red states are places that have been hardest hit by the severe weather events. Think of hurricanes slamming into Florida or the Carolinas, or hurricanes slamming into Texas. the unseasonable, shocking cold wave that Texas had last year that almost brought down its energy grid system. And at the same time, here's the irony. You know what, by far, the biggest wind energy producing state in the United States is? Texas.
Right.
Yeah. And so, so they're actually benefiting from some of this movement. But, Texas is a state whose economy was largely built on fossil fuel industry. They're not going to step away from that. So, but that is an absolute political divide. And the Republican talking point will be, you're going to destroy the economy if you focus on this. This is some left-wing liberal, hippy dippy deal, and we're all about growing the economy and creating jobs. I mean, that'll be their argument. And
unfortunately, as we've seen from the U.S. gun control debate, it's rarely logical.
And abortion.
Yeah.
I mean, those are real absolute divides. I mean, there are a lot of Democrats who are gun owners that talk about the need for gun safety regulation. I mean, look, I was ambassador to Germany. A lot of Germans love to hunt. But, in order to get a gun, you got to know how to field dress a deer. You need to, it's harder to get a gun permit, way harder than to learn, get a driver's license. It's like this thick of a book. You've got to learn.
Fairly logical, that one.
Yeah, exactly. And their requirements, you've got to lock your weapons separately from your ammunition. You have to keep those separately locked or what have you. And, there are a lot of things that could make sense, but oh boy, in America, an 18-year-old, as they did it, this kid did in Uvalde, who murdered all those little children, an 18-year-old can go in and buy a weapon of war, an assault weapon, and go to a school and shoot people up.
Yeah, no, it's truly
tragic.
Horrible. It really is. One last question from the floor without notice. Just what black swan events are you considering at the moment?
Well, I wish I was smart enough to have said last weekend, but I do wonder, and this could be impacted by last weekend. I wonder how close Israel will let Iran get, and they're very close as it is, to nuclear breakout, to have nuclear capacity to produce nuclear weapons before doing something about it. I mean, something more than, murdering or assassinating some of the scientists or cyber attack or whatever. Attack. Yeah, I mean, I think
bombing a facility.
But the facilities I think are now pretty well underground. They're in mountains and things like that. So it's, this isn't going to be like when they bombed the facility in Iraq and that surprise attack. So it's just sort of sitting there out in the open. So that could potentially be a black swan event.
Well, let's hope it doesn't come to that.
Yeah, black swan events are rarely good.
Yes, correct. Well, we don't think of them when they come to mind. John, that's been an incredibly diverse and detailed run through on everything today. I want to thank you very much again for your time and for your expertise. And thank you everyone for listening.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. And again, thanks for giving up your lunch hour to be with us. Appreciate it.
Have a great day. Thank you.
Take care.